Let's now quickly talk about the three other promise combinators, which are raise, allSettled, and any. And the first one we're going to talk about is promise.raise. So like this. And promise.raise, just like all other combinators, receives an array of promises, and it also returns a promise. Now this promise returned by promise.raise is settled as soon as one of the input promises settles. And remember that settled simply means that a value is available, but it doesn't matter if the promise got rejected or fulfilled. And so in promise.raise, basically the first settled promise wins the race. But let's now actually see this in action. And I will create a quick iffy here so that I can use async await without like creating a whole new function with a name. And so, as always, then we use await, promise, and in this case, dot raise. And let's also store it here as a response. And now here let's define an array of promises. And let's just get this JSON here, so this get JSON function, and try it with 3 countries. Let's say Italy, and do this 3 times. Let's say Egypt, and then also Mexico. And so now these 3 promises will basically race against each other like in a real race. Now, if the winning promise is then a fulfilled promise, then the fulfillment value of this whole race promise is going to be the fulfillment value of the winning promise. So that's more obvious than it maybe sounds. So let's just see the result here in the console. And so we got Italy. But if we try this again, then maybe we get another result, because then maybe another call is going to be faster. But well, it seems to be always Italy. But now it's Mexico. And let's actually see this in the network tab. So making it smaller again. And so you see that indeed Mexico is the one who took the least time. So it has the smallest bar here, and it also was the fastest of the 3. Right? This time the fastest was Egypt here by far, and so that's what we should see in the console. Okay? So again, just keep in mind that here in promise.raise, we only get one result and not an array of the results of all the 3. Now a promise that gets rejected can actually also win the race. And so we say that promise.raise short circuits whenever one of the promises gets settled. And so again, that means no matter if fulfilled or rejected. So let's try some weird name here. And so now it is the rejected promise that won, basically. But let's go back here to as it was and see another example, because in the real world, promise.raise is actually very useful to prevent against never-ending promises or also very long-running promises. For example, if your user has a very bad internet connection, then a fetch request in your application might take way too long to actually be useful. And so we can create a special timeout promise which automatically rejects after a certain time has passed. So let's do that. And it's going to be similar to the wait function that we created earlier, but the difference is that this one is actually going to reject and not going to resolve. So this time let's actually pass in milliseconds. Or, well, let's just pass in seconds, just to make it consistent with the other one. So return new promise and the executor function. And again, in this case, we will not resolve, but reject. And so here for the resolve function, which is always the first one, we can once again use this throwaway variable. So using this convention. And then here reject and set timeout. And here we specify a callback function. And so we say that after a certain amount of seconds, let's call it sec, like this actually. So after this time has passed, we reject the promise. So we create a new error saying request took too long. And so now we can simply have the AJAX call that we were talking about earlier race against this timeout. All right. So let me show you what that means. So promise.raise. And then here, the first promise, let's use again or get JSON. So this is basically what we are interested in here. And let's use another country, Tanzania again. And the second promise is then going to be or timeout. So let's say that we only want to wait like 1 second. And so we will have these two then race against each other. And if the timeout happens first, then all of this here will be rejected, right? And so basically that will then abort the fetch that is happening here in getJSON. So I could have used, again, async await, but why not use the then method also here? So in this case, let's just log the response, or we could have called it data, but that's not really important here. And here the error, and let's just also log it to the console in case there is any. And so now we have request took too long, but that was very fast. Oh, and here we have to multiply it by 1,000. So again, this one takes milliseconds and not just seconds. Okay, so we got Tanzania pretty fast, and so it was faster than 1 second. And so therefore, it did not time out. But let's not try 0.1 seconds. And so now we see that the request took too long. So 0.1 seconds was not enough for this request here to get finished. And you will have to experiment with different values here because this is going to depend on your internet connection. So let's see 0.2 seconds. And so now the request was actually fast enough so that it didn't time out. So with 0.15 seconds, again, it takes too long. And so then this promise here is the result of promise.raise. So that's pretty useful. And in the real world, of course, you will use a larger number, let's say like 5 seconds. Okay, so that's promise.raise. And in fact, promise.raise and promise.all are by far the two most important promise combinators. But let me show you also the other two that we have. So the next one is promise.allSettled. And this one is a pretty new one. It is from ES 2020. And it is actually a very simple one. So it takes in an array of promises again, and it will simply return an array of all the settled promises. And so again, no matter if the promises got rejected or not. So it's similar to promise.all in regard that it also returns an array of all the results, but the difference is that promise.all will short circuit as soon as one promise rejects, but promise.allSettled simply never short circuits. So it will simply return all the results of all the promises. So promise.allSettled. And so now here I will create actually the most basic example ever. So I will simply fake promises by saying promise.resolve success. All right. And so you already know that this here automatically creates a promise that is resolved. And so we don't have to wait for anything to finish like this here. Okay. So then we can have a couple of more. Here we have a rejected one. So let's say error, and here another one. Let's say another success. Okay. And then here we can just call then, and let's see. All right. Now here we want actually all of the results. All right. And so indeed, here we get 3 results, even though one of them rejected. Okay. So this is the result of the 3 promises. And yeah, so this is how they look like when we do them manually with resolve, reject, and resolve. Just contrast that with promise.all. So that would then look different. So here we would get an error. Okay, so of course we can also catch the error then. And so here we would simply get error, and that's again because the .all promise combinator will short circuit if there is one error, if there is one rejected promise. So that's the difference between these two. But now let's go to the last one, which is promise.any. So like this. Now promise.any is even more modern. It is ES 2021. And actually at the time of recording, this one doesn't work in my browser, but probably by the time I'm releasing this course, it will work in the latest version of Google Chrome. And so let me simply do this here as well. So all I'm going to do is to just copy this example here and then do any. And this is not going to work. Let me show you. So we get promise.any is not a function, but again, in your case, it might already work. So let me simply explain what it does. So as always, promise.any takes in an array of multiple promises, and this one will then return the first fulfilled promise, and it will simply ignore rejected promises. So basically, promise.any is very similar to promise.raise, with the difference that rejected promises are ignored. And so therefore, the result of promise.any is always going to be a fulfilled promise, unless of course all of them reject. Okay, but at the time you're watching this video, again, this should already work, and then maybe you can experiment a little bit with this to see the difference between all the 4 promise combinators. And again, the most important ones are definitely promise.all and promise.raise. So keep at least these 2 in mind for your own projects.